So, just so we understand the context of this story, in the time leading up to this story, the people of Israel had been worshipping idols and sacrificing to the local false gods, uh, among whom was included Baal. At the time, Israel is constantly at war or having conflict with a neighboring people called the Philistines. The Philistines also lived in the land where Israel lived, called the land of Canaan, otherwise referred to as the Promised Land because God promised them that they would one day live there. And during one of these battles between Israel and the Philistines, the Ark of the Covenant was taken. The Ark is captured by the Philistines and taken back to Philistia, to their country. And the Ark is kept there for over 7 months. Now, the story of what happens to the Ark while it is there is a fascinating story, but today we're going to be focusing on what happens after the Ark returns to Israel, because then things really begin to happen, and we'll read in First Samuel chapter 7 from the end of verse 2. So after the ark is returned to Israelite territory, verse 2 says, "Then all the people of Israel turned back to the Lord." So there is talk here in this verse of a turning of the people. After years of not speaking to God or failing to acknowledge his leadership, they are wishing to return. At this point, a man called Samuel serves as leader in Israel. He is what is called a judge. He communicated between the people and God, and he promoted justice and order in the country of Israel. And so, as the people are turning back to God, the text says, "So Samuel said to the Israelites, 'If you are returning to the Lord with all your hearts, then rid yourselves of the foreign gods and the Ashtoreths, and commit yourselves to the Lord and serve him only, and he will deliver you out of the hands of the Philistines.'" So the Israelites, it says, put away their Baals and Ashtoreths and served the Lord only. So we might read these words, Baals and Ashtoreths, in the Old Testament a lot, but what on earth actually are they? Well, yes, they are idols, but there's a bit more to it than that. So, as we mentioned, Israel lives in the land of Canaan, but other peoples lived in the surrounding countries around them too. And as we've already established, one of these people groups is called the Philistines. And the Philistines were some of the bitterest enemies of Israel. The Philistines constantly attacked the Israelites and constantly sought to kill Israelites and sometimes succeeded. The Philistines were a people group that did not serve the God of Israel. They had their own deities. And of the several they had of the gods, there were two main ones, the two most powerful gods who were on the top of their religion. And we're going to have a look at them now. The male god Baal and the female goddess Asherah. Now, the Philistines believed that that Baal was the god of life. He was the main, most powerful god of the Philistines. And Baal's statues or images depicted him as holding a thunderbolt, or a flash of lightning, you might also call it, because the Philistines believed that Baal's weapon was thunder. So he holds a thunderbolt in his hand like a sword, as you can see in the picture. And this is actually a picture of an artifact found from the ancient times. So this is a real depiction of how they viewed Baal. And secondly, there was the goddess which the Philistines worshipped. She was called Asherah. Now, Asherah was the mother goddess. She was the goddess of fertility. And people would do this thing where they set up Asherah poles, or sometimes called Ashroth poles, depending on your translation. And these Asherah poles were wooden poles with the goddess's image carved into them. These poles would be stuck into the ground in order to honor the goddess and to promote fertility because people hoped that it would make things go well for them in their lives. So Baal and Asherah are almost like the father god and the mother god of the Philistines. But hold on. Throughout the biblical story, the Israelites are recorded as constantly worshiping the gods Baal and Asherah. They are constantly going back to these idols. What on earth are the Israelites doing with the gods of their enemies? By putting their hope in the Philistines' gods and hoping that the Philistine god will save them and make their lives better is literally like the Israelites betting against themselves. It's like me hoping my garden will bloom and flourish by watering my neighbor's garden. At first, it seems mind-numbingly dumb. And we may ask, why on earth would Israelites bow to the God of their enemies, give gifts to the God of their enemies? This was no little matter. They sacrificed their children to Baal, hoping that it would go well with them. Why are they wasting their time? And this may seem very shocking, but I think this sort of behavior is perhaps not so far removed from our own lives as we may think. Because if we are to honestly look at our own lives, we too invest in things that can't help us or that hurt us all the time. For example, we recognize that the fashion world has affected our views on women's bodies and given us unhealthy beauty standards and all the self-hatred which results from that. And yet we invest our time in reading the magazines and buying the clothes and keeping up with the trends, and we even judge other people for not doing the same. We recognize other harmful things, such as the pressure of social media, where we almost have to look as though we're constantly happy and our world is fine and our life is successful, and yet we keep up with social media. And we do so many other things, from eating junk food to investing in toxic relationships. And how many times have you heard the saying, money doesn't buy happiness? But still, many of us buy into the idea that if we hustle in order to become wealthy, then we'll be better off and we'll be happy. I just like to clarify, I'm not for one moment claiming that any of these things are by default idols, but they can be. What we do is that we take the empty promises of the society around us, the promises that tell us they can help us, they can save us, they can make us happy or successful, or they can make us winners. And we invest our time, our energy, our children, our talents. We work towards these things. We, in essence, constantly bet against ourselves. And we constantly struggle with investing in things that actually harm us. And suddenly the absurdity of Israel worshiping the gods of their enemies doesn't seem so far removed from our own daily struggles. But let's return to the story, because there's real movement in Israel happening. After years of darkness, of sacrificing children to Baal, of praying to statues of dead rock and metal and wood, they are returning to a living God. So what happens when they do return? Well, as the people begin to want to seek God, Samuel challenges them to follow up this desire with action. He says, put the things away that can't help you, that will never be able to save you, that can't hear your prayers. And they do. In this beautiful time, they put aside those empty things, their Baal idols, their Asherah poles. But the story doesn't stop there. Samuel then says, let's get together and reconnect with God. We continue from verse 5. Samuel says, assemble all Israel at Mizpah and I will intercede with the Lord for you." When they had assembled at Mizpah, they drew water and poured it out before the Lord. On that day they fasted, and there they confessed, "We have sinned against the Lord." So in this beautiful scene, the whole country, imagine a whole nation of Israel is coming together in one place called Mizpah. They all fast together, they all pray together, and they confess, "We have sinned. We have done something that is wrong. We've followed lies, and we want to come back to God. We want to be reunited." And there, as they all pray together, Samuel prays for them, asking God to forgive them all. But then something happens. We continue to read from verse 7. When the Philistines heard that Israel had assembled at Mizpah, the rulers of the Philistines came up to attack them. So news travels fast, and the Philistines hear the news that the Israelites are all gathered together in one place, and they think, "This is our chance. We can pretty much wipe them all out in one day." And this is a particularly dangerous situation for the Israelites because they've been fasting. So their strength is low because they haven't been eating. They're all in one place, vulnerable. And you might ask yourself at this point in the story, is this what happens when people turn from Baal and Asherah and try to return to God? Well, let's continue reading. When the Israelites heard this, they were afraid because of the Philistines. They said to Samuel, "Do not stop crying out to the Lord our God for us, that he may rescue us from the hands of the Philistines." Verse 9. Then Samuel took a suckling lamb and sacrificed it as a whole burnt offering to the Lord. He cried out to the Lord on Israel's behalf, and the Lord answered him. While Samuel was still sacrificing the burnt offering, the Philistines drew near to engage Israel in battle. But that day the Lord thundered with such loud thunder against the Philistines that it threw them into such a panic that they were defeated in front of the Israelites. So the Israelites are trying to ask God for help, and the Philistines come against them to harm them. And God defends the Israelites by thundering so loudly with thunder from the sky that it causes these great Philistine warriors to be terrified and confused and run away. Let's go back to something for a moment. If you remember, Baal's weapon was a thunderbolt. He was the Philistines' god of thunder. But that day, God sent two messages. And the first message was to the Israelites. He's saying, "You have been worshiping Baal, who holds a thunderbolt in his hand, but I am the one who will save you today. Those empty things can't help you. They are dead and nothing, but even after you fail me, I will save you." And God sent a second message that day, and this one was to the Philistines. He's saying, "You think that your God, Baal, is the God of thunder. I am God. I control the thunder. I control the weather. I make life. Not Baal. I am God, not Baal." So in what we've just read, God won a battle for Israel that day. And verse 12 says, "After these things, Samuel took a stone and set it up between Mizpah and Shen. He named it Ebenezer, saying, 'The Lord has helped us this far.'" And following this story, the text tells us that the Philistines were humbled and they stopped invading Israel's territory as long as Samuel was alive. They basically stayed on their side of the border. And Israel even managed to take back some of the territories which the Philistines had taken from them in previous battles. Now there's an old hymn which is called "Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing." It's a familiar hymn to many, And I've often stood in congregations listening as people thunderously sing a line from this song. And this line is, "Here I raise my Ebenezer." And each time we arrive at this line in the second verse of the song, I wonder how many people standing around me actually understand the words that they're singing. I mean, what is an Ebenezer and why are we raising it? Well, as we've seen in this story, in fact, the word Ebenezer comes from the Bible to commemorate the victory God won for Israel that day. As we read, Samuel raised up a stone to stand as a statue or a monument or memorial. Ebenezer in Hebrew means stone of help. And after Samuel had raised that stone up, anyone who passed it in Israel would remember, they'd have a physical reminder. Oh, God helped us on that day. He fought for the Israelites on that day. In a similar way to the story in 1 Samuel, Ebenezer has come to refer to a memorial, a way to remember something God has done in the past. Now, sometimes such reminders can be very powerful and they can be comforting, because when we try to recall what God has done in the past, we may possibly find confidence in that He will act again on our behalf in the present and the future. And this is why the next line of the hymn goes, "Here I raise my Ebenezer, hither by thy help I've come," which simply means, if we translate it from the Old English, I raise my stone of help here, my reminder of what you've done. I've come this far by your help. I don't know if anyone here today feels worried about their future. Maybe things are unclear at the moment. Maybe things are going very, very wrong. Maybe your week has been filled with failure and you're afraid of failing again. I'd like to invite you, if you believe that it's right, to try in what ways you can to distance yourself from the empty things around you that promise help, but are no more capable of helping you than a dead piece of wood. I'd like to encourage you to look at your own Ebenezers and the Ebenezers in other people's lives and stories, like the one here in 1 Samuel, and to remember how God has helped in the past, how alive He is. And maybe those reminders may help us to believe in what He can and will do. And even if you're a tactile or a visual person, you may benefit from more tangible reminders. You can write a song about an Ebenezer or record it in your diary so you can read it later. You can even physically place a stone in your bedroom, on your bedside table, or in your garden. But just something that symbolically reminds you of a time, a specific time where God has helped you or someone else. I'd like to invite us all today and in the coming week to ask for help and life from the living God. And even if things get hard in difficult times, we might be able to say, as Samuel said, "The Lord has helped us this far.